Every mainstream programming language, such as Python, has an ecosystem of libraries that can give you some extra capabilities beyond those that are built into the programming language itself in what we would call standard libraries. Now, Python actually has pretty extensive standard libraries. We've used CSVs from the standard library and random numbers from the standard library. Well, some things are a little bit beyond the scope of the programming language, such as charting and visualizations of data, or machine learning and scientific computing applications, or game engines. And so there are third-party libraries where the first party is Python, the language and the primary packages that are standard by default. And the second party is you, if you were custom developing your own libraries for your own tools. And the third party is anybody else outside of that relationship. So third-party libraries are available, and they're organized in an ecosystem called pip, is the most common one in Python. So let me just show you pip really quickly. So if I search for pip, pip is a tool that is part of this PyPI, which actually, let me make this visible on the screen, ecosystem. So the Python package index is what the PI part of the PyPI stands for, is an index where, notice, there's almost 300,000 projects or third-party libraries that are available here, and lots of people who are making use of this. So if I were to search for one that we're about to try out, it's called Seaborn. And Seaborn is for statistical data visualization or for charting, right? So if we were to look at it, we could see that there's some instructions here that we could use pip to install Seaborn, which we're about to try doing. But this will tell us a little bit about what the library is all about. And one of the things that is on most packages, certainly most popular packages that are very popular third-party libraries, we can see that this one's pretty popular. It's got 9,000 people have started it on GitHub, which is a good indication that people will find it valuable. So if we go to the homepage of this, we'll see that there's actually a complete website for this library that has examples of the kinds of visualizations and charts you can make with it. In this video, we're not going to do anything nearly as complex as these charts that you're seeing here. But what's kind of neat is you get a gallery of different things you can do. And so if we were to look at, I don't know how this violin plot works, well, it actually gives you the sample code for how you could reproduce a chart like this using Seaborn. And these libraries are going to come with tutorials typically for how to achieve certain things that give you some narrative, as well as what we call the API, or the Application Programming Interface. And the API are going to be the things that we use. So for example, we're about to try using the bar plot. And this bar plot documentation tells you a little bit about how to make use of this given chart with some examples and things like that. So this is a pretty common among any library that lots of people use. They'll have their own website that tell you how to work with these things. But let's go and actually try making use of this in our workspace and in a Jupyter notebook. So in order to make use of a third-party library, you need to install its packages and its modules. So the way that we typically do that is through the pip command. So Python M, and then we have this pip is the program that helps us manage our packages. And then we're going to give pip the command to install, and Seaborn is the package we're trying to install. So when I evaluate this, some things happen and it tells me that we're installing some things. If you get a warning, you can ignore that warning. That's totally fine. And I should update pip. My pip is a little bit out of date, but that's okay. The important line is that we were successfully able to install this third-party library. Okay, so now we have access to import this into our programs. So let's try making a new file that will be a barplot.ipynb. So we're going to make a Python notebook that is a bar plot. And from here, what I'm going to do is go ahead and let's just make some documentation of what this is. Example of importing Seaborn, a third-party library. All right. And we need to convert the cell to Markdown. Okay. And let's just make a very simple bar chart as an example. So I'm going to press the Shift Enter shortcut to evaluate that cell as Markdown and then set me off into a new code cell, or what would have been the next cell, but since there wasn't a next cell, it's just here and available to us. So here, it created one on our behalf. We are going to import Seaborn. So one of the ways that we can do this is import Seaborn. And I'm going to do that in its own cell. And notice that it takes a second, but hopefully that was able to complete without any errors evaluating that cell. If for some reason you had some errors, it may be that your Jupyter kernel is not running on the same version of Python that you installed the package with. So be sure that your the version, if you click on what Python version the kernel is using, you can select the most recent version, and hopefully that will ensure that you've got the Seaborn package available to you. And then, what we saw in the documentation was there's this bar plot function that's defined inside of the Seaborn module. Okay, so let's try using that. And we could say bar plot Seaborn dot bar plot. And notice there's all these parameters that we can give. And we haven't really spent any time talking about the idea of a keyword parameter. But when there are functions that have lots of different parameters in some of these third-party libraries, like this is an example, there's just a ton of parameters here. It's really cumbersome to have to specify all of them. And as we've learned about parameters, you typically have to write them in the correct order, right? Like one parameter comes after the other and the positioning of these matter. Well, Python has this clever trick that is pretty specific to Python. A few other languages have this, but none of the other mainstream ones that I can think of. And what we can do is we can say, which parameter specifically are we trying to give it? So let's give it the X parameter. And let's make X our labels. So let's just make this something very simple. So say A, B, C, and D, just a list of labels. And then for Y, we're going to give, say, numbers like 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and 4.0. All right, so just some very simple fabricated data. And when we evaluate this cell, what's pretty neat is if I scroll down, let me make this just a little bit smaller so everything stays on my screen, we get a chart. And look at that, it's a beautiful little bar chart that has the data we provided on the x-axis. Those list of labels are shown down beneath each bar, and then the values that correspond to them on the y. Now, the important thing that I wanted to demonstrate in this video is this idea that there are third-party libraries out there that are pretty easy to install, right? We had to run a command, we had to know what the package name was, and then we just import it into our programs, and we can start using, pretty sophisticated code that other people have made available to us for free as open source software, and that's pretty powerful. If we wanted to, we could look more specifically at how some of these other styles were achieved, how to use, if you look in the tutorial, you can see that there's ways of controlling the aesthetic and using different color palettes for our bars. But for now, we're going to leave the nuance of how to style and make other kinds of charts to future videos. This video was primarily to introduce you to the idea of third-party libraries and give you a sense of what it takes to work with them. One last thing I want to mention when it comes to third-party libraries is that there's a convention that in your projects, you have a file in your workspace. You're going to have a file that's named requirements.txt. And if we look over here, I think we actually have it hidden in our course workspace by default. But if you were to open up a terminal and write the command code, which should open up this in VS Code, and then requirements.txt, you'll notice there's this file. And if yours didn't open up, don't worry, you're not going to need to edit anything in here for this purposes. I just want to show you that this exists. these are all of the libraries that are third-party libraries that our course depends on. And that when you set up your workspace initially, you ran a command that you had no idea what it did at the time, but it was python-m pip install-r requirements.txt was the command. And what it did was it took all of these package names, so PyTest, MyPy, and some others that might feel familiar. So matplotlib is one of them. Jupyter we already pre-installed, and some other things. And it went ahead and installed all of those packages when you got started. If we were trying to maintain good practice here, we could also say visualization and add Seaborn here, right? And so typically most projects, when you're working on larger Python projects that involve many third-party libraries, you'll keep this file in the workspace. It's called requirements.txt, and it'll just be the list of all of the third-party libraries that your project or your workspace depends on. So that when you go and you share this and somebody else on your team needs to get started with your project, they have the complete list of all of the modules that are needed in order to run it. And this is just a best practice, right? So this is a quick introduction to third-party libraries. There's a whole world of really exciting, interesting libraries out there in Python, especially. It's a really vibrant community of open source developers who make great tools available. We just saw Seaborn, just the tip of the iceberg there, and there are many other great tools we'll be interacting with as well.